Hey, welcome back to Diode Press. I'm Graham. So in today's video, we're going to make two things that we're going to need to carve and eventually print our Linocut. So the first thing we're going to make is a bench hook, and I mentioned this back in video 1. And so basically when you're carving your block, you want to be able to always carve away from your fingers so you don't, inadvertently cut yourself. So a bench hook mounts on the edge of your desk and holds the block in place. And you can also use that drawer liner that I mentioned, but a bench hook's kind of a cheap, easy thing to make, and it'll really make it easier to carve. And the second thing we're going to make is a registration jig. And what that's going to do is allow us to register our block and our paper both on the printing press and also just like on your desktop when you print by hand. Because I'll go through both methods in this video series. So let's jump right into making these two things. So to make a bench hook, you only need a couple basic things. So I'm going to be using a small handsaw, wood glue, and you can use a hammer and nails, or I'm going to be using a staple gun and staples to put mine together. And then you'll need a couple strips of wood. So you'll need a piece for the base of your bench hook, which I'm using this piece for, and then you'll need a piece for the end supports. So I'm using this small 1/2 inch by 1/2 inch piece of wood. And so depending on how big of a piece of linoleum you're going to be using, you'll have to use a different size base for your bench hook. So in my case, if I was just making it for a small block, I could use just this piece of wood as is. So I'd have my base, and I'd have my piece of wood up here that would be supported to keep the block from sliding. And then I have the other piece down here to hook on the edge of my desk. But since I'm going to be using a much larger block, this 6x8 block, I'm just going to take this one piece of wood and just cut it in half, put them side by side, and then go through the same process. And so now when I put these two pieces side by side, it's plenty big for my linoleum block that I'll be using. So now I'm just going to secure the back panel up here, and that'll hide the edge and that'll keep the block from sliding around. And then I'll have to do the same thing on the bottom back here. So I have to cut this long dowel in half. I'm using just basswood, which is a really soft wood and it's really easy to cut. But you can use really any wood for this. Now we can go ahead and glue it all together. So the first piece we're going to glue right here, which eventually will be on the bottom. So when it's all done, it'll sit like this against your desk and keep it from going away. So I'm just going to put a small bead of glue on that piece just to hold it. And I put a small bead of glue down the seam between the two pieces. And again, this isn't fine woodworking, it's just to keep the block from sliding around. And you can buy these pre-made, they're not too expensive, but if you have some scrap wood laying around, it's a quick project. And you can use a hammer and nails, whatever works. I'm going to use just this staple gun. The glue is really what's going to hold it together. So there's one side. A couple more nails and we'll be all done. Alright, I think that's it. Now you can see the block, it has this panel on the back. It sits right up against the edge of our desk. Now when we put our Linocut block on here, you can put it right up against this back support. And now when you're carving, you don't have to worry about holding the block from sliding away. And if you want to, work at an angle, you can just rotate the block and it'll push up against this back panel. So it's super simple. It took just a couple minutes to put together from some scrap wood. And if you don't want to make one of these, you can also use that drawer liner I showed in the first video, on your work surface, and it'll also help keep your block from sliding around. But you just want to make sure that, you're always just cutting away from your fingers. Because, it really hurts when you stab yourself with these things. Alright, so that was really easy to make. So now we have a nice bench hook. Like I said, it's not fine woodworking, but it just took a few minutes. I'll probably take it out and give it a couple coats of paint just so it looks nicer in the in the videos. And now we're going to move on to making the registration jig, and that's going to be used to keep the block from sliding around when we print it, and it'll help us line up the paper on the block. And that's a really quick project to put together as well. So after that, then we'll be able to move on to carving our block and getting ready to print. So making the registration jig, there's a bunch of different ways again to do this. In the past, I've made a cutout where the whole block sits in it, and then your paper can fit across it. But I think for this project, I'm just going to do an L-shaped, corner piece. So that'll allow us to register the block in a corner, and then also have the paper be able to line up as well. So all you need for this is whatever block you're going to be using, so your dimensions, an X-Acto blade, something to cut with. I'm going to be using just white, all-purpose glue, and then a piece of this foam core board. I think this is a 1/4 inch thick. So the first thing we need to do is figure out how big our paper is going to be. So this is a 6x8 block. So to make printing kind of easier, I want to make sure I have a couple inches around the whole block of paper, white border space. So if I say, 2 inches, 10 inches tall, and then 12 inches wide. And, after we're all done, we can always tear the paper down smaller, but I like to have enough to be able to handle and grip onto. And that way when you go to mat it later, you have some options. So I'm first going to cut out the base layer of our registration jig. So I'm going to cut an L shape here out of this mat board. And you want to make sure that you have enough border in here so you can have room for the paper and also that everything kind of fits in there. And you can always cut this, based on the size of your block. This will be bigger or smaller. But once it's put together, you'll see how it's made and you can adapt it for your print. So my block's going to sit right here once it's cut out. So I don't need all this extra material right now. So this triangle I'm using has a nice metal edge on it, and it kind of makes cutting easier. So I'll just use the block as a kind of a straight edge here to make sure I get a good angle. If you do a few light passes with this foam core, it cuts pretty easily. Now I can cut out this L shape. You want to make sure you get this corner a perfect 90 or as close as you can, so the block sits in there nice and square. And there's our first L shape. And so we'll be able to print, tape this down to our press bed or onto our, our desk wherever we're printing, and then the block will sit in that corner. And so every time when we go to use a different block, we have different layers, they can all just sit right in that same shape and they always line up properly. We need to work on registering the paper now onto the block. So we'll need some way to make sure we have it lined up properly. So if this was unmounted linoleum, lower to the desk here, we could just make marks on this base panel and be able to, put the corner down and line it up. But since this is mounted and pretty thick, it's going to take 2 pieces of this foam core board to raise it up to the same level as the block. So I'm going to cut 2 more of these L shapes just to raise up this base platform. Now I can just stack the 3 pieces. So we have our base, our block sits in there. I'm going to offset these a little bit. That way if there's ever any ink or anything on the edge here, it doesn't get onto my jig. So next I'll just use some white glue and just glue these 3 layers together. Alright, so now it's all glued up. So our last step is just to mark where the paper is going to lay. And you can add another layer here if you wanted to actually hold the paper. If you want to add a couple strips in here, so the paper, your block would sit in there, and then your paper could sit right in there. So if you want to do it that way, but I'm going to use just blue painter's tape and just put tape down where I want. Because that way if I decide later I want to, maybe I want less border or more border, I can just peel up that tape, move it, and use this registration jig for another project. There you go. So now your block sits in there nicely. When we have our paper all torn down, when we go to print after it's inked up, we'll just line this up right up against this tape. And it'll line up perfectly every time. And then once we have multiple blocks, we can swap out the block, put a new one in, and when we go to do our second layer, we'll be able to get it in the exact same position. Alright, so now we have our registration jig, so when we go to print, we're all ready for that. And we have our quick and simple bench hook, so in the next video we can start carving. I'll see you then, thanks. Thanks for watching. To keep up with the videos when they're posted, make sure to subscribe to the channel. And if you want to help support this channel, you can check out the Diode Press Patreon page, where I post behind the scenes photos, as well as other patron rewards. Thanks!